Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you here today for this session on nature for adaptation, mobilizing climate finance to support nature-based solutions. We're going to give people a few more minutes to join. We have a big audience today and a lot of great speakers. My name is Cristina Rombitis Del Rio. I'm a senior associate with the climate resilience practice at the World Resources Institute. I'll be your moderator for today. I want to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be distributed following the event. And we'll also have time for questions and answers during the panel and following the panel discussion. So please do put any questions you have into the chat box and we'll try and address as many of them as possible as we can during this session. Our objectives for today are really exciting. We're glad to be launching a new World Resources working paper entitled Public International Funding of Nature-Based Solutions for Adaptation, a Landscape Assessment. This was produced for the Global Commission on Adaptation as part of the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track. And we'll be hearing from the report's authors and getting some key findings from that. But in addition to that, we'll be getting perspectives, experiences, and emerging priorities from several key donors that are working and supporting nature-based solutions across the globe. And really a leading implementing country, we'll be hearing from Peru, that is doing some exciting work on NBS to share their experiences. So to kick us off, we have a few high-level remarks from Manish Bapna, the Executive Vice President and Managing Director for the World Resources Institute, and Ambassador Patricia Fuller, Canada's Ambassador for Climate Change. They have both been very heavily involved in contributing to the work of the Global Commission on Adaptation, the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track in particular, and we really thank them for leading the charge on this critical issue. Ambassador Fuller, I'm going to turn to you first, and I really want to thank you for joining us, as well as your consistent leadership and championing of nature-based solutions. This has been absolutely that you and your team have really made the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track a success. And we really look forward to your continued collaboration with Canada and the World Resources Institute and others on this issue. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour à tout le monde. I'm joining you today from Ottawa, the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And it's a great pleasure to be here to be part of the launch of this important and timely report on public international funding for nature-based solutions. And I congratulate WRI and climate finance advisors for the preparation of this report that Canada was pleased to have been able to support. Working with nature and not against it to combat climate change is an important policy priority for Canada. And this is because we know that nature helps us to build resilience to climate change, as well as to absorb carbon and to generate many other benefits associated with protection and restoration of nature. But despite this incredible potential, this opportunity remains largely untapped in adaptation strategies and programs. And for this reason, in Canada, in our strengthened climate plan, which was released in December, we made nature an important pillar of that plan. And we're enabling the uptake of nature-based solutions through our conservation commitments, as well as for funding for projects, and by working with Indigenous partners from coast to coast to protect nature. And then internationally, we were so pleased to come together with Mexico to co-lead the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track for the Global Commission on Adaptation. And in this work, we recognized that financing for nature-based solutions is clearly insufficient. And we worked in this action track to identify innovative financing models for generating investment in nature-based solutions and work to understand the barriers for unlocking and accelerating investments in NBS. And in the call to action that we made at the conclusion of this work, we noted that donor countries and financial institutions must consider NBS in their commitments to increase international public finance ahead of COP26, and Canada is committed to doing this. So this report is very timely and very useful for donors like Canada and others that are looking to increase our commitments to nature-based solutions. It also shows that it's early days for donor investments in nature-based solutions and makes this report all the much more important. So in closing, I just want to say a big thank you to WRI and to Manish, Bapna in particular for your leadership in this important work and your collaboration with Canada as part of the action track work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Fuller, for your leadership on this and really championing this issue and continued work in all ways on nature-based solutions. Manish, I want to turn it over to you for some high-level remarks, and in particular, as we look towards COP, where you think this issue needs to be positioned to have maximum impact.
Great, thank you, Christina, and I want to start by huge thanks, Patricia, to you, to your colleagues in Canada, to Mexico, to all the other NBS Action Track partners. I think the work that we've done over the past couple of years in raising the visibility of nature-based solutions for adaptation and starting to really generate some concrete actions is incredibly important. Just a few framing comments at the outset for this particular session. Nature matters. We all know that. We all know that healthy ecosystems underpin entire economies, all of human society. They produce a wide range of ecosystem services, including food and fuel. They deliver economic gains. They support livelihoods. But the importance of nature has come even into starker relief this past year. We've seen the connection between nature and human health. COVID-19 has demonstrated the importance of protecting nature as critical to protecting human health. One only needs to think about the dreadful impacts of major zoonotic diseases, SARS, AIDS, a variety of others. We've also seen in this past year that if we're serious about the race to zero, about achieving a 1.5 degree pathway, the importance of nature, investing in nature-based solutions to avoid emissions, sequester carbon, absolutely critical. Climate mitigation depends in no small part on protecting and restoring nature. But perhaps most importantly, we've also seen that the response to the pandemic and the economic lockdown has made us much more appreciative of resilience, about the importance of resilience to pandemics, to economic crises, but also to the climate crisis. And so the role of nature-based solutions in building resilience to climate adaptation is something that I think has become even more important, recognized today than it has been in the past. Yet, financing for nature-based solutions is highly inadequate. And that's particularly true for nature-based solutions for adaptation. Most of you know about the study that was done, published in Nature by Griscom and colleagues a few years ago. 30% of the climate mitigation solution by 2030, only 3% to climate finance. You've seen the stimulus programs in response to the pandemic, largely brown, not very green. A lot of attention today is being placed on how to channel finance from the corporate sector to offsets or to nature-based solution offsets to help them reduce and kind of address residual emissions from companies, a complex, difficult set of challenges for that conversation. But how much funding is actually going into nature-based solutions for resilience, for adaptation? And how do we actually address the barriers and increase public funding for resilience? That is what this paper is about and why it's so important as a complement to all these other conversations that are taking place today. And the timing couldn't be more appropriate. We're here in such an important year when we have so many critical action-forcing international moments during 2021, whether it is the Food Systems Summit, the Ocean Action Summit, whether it's the Biodiversity Summit in Kunming, and then ultimately the Climate Summit in Glasgow. These are an incredibly important set of moments where we can really try to address these barriers, increase public funding for nature-based solutions, for adaptation. So an incredibly important moment to really take these recommendations forward. I want to just close that the timing of this session is also fortuitous because, as most of you know, today's March 15th, the Ides of March. What you may recall from your school day kind of Greek and Roman history lessons is that the Ides of March was the end date the deadline when you have to repay your debts. And I thought it was quite apropos that if we don't repay our debts back to nature, one should beware the Ides of March. So a good moment to have this conversation. Christina, looking forward to the discussion. Back to you.
Thank you, Manish. That's a good reminder that we do need to repay our debts to nature. Without further ado, I'd like to turn to both Jonathan and Stacy, two of the report authors, Jonathan Cook, Senior Associate of the Climate Resilience Practice at WRI, and Stacy Swan, CEO and founding partner for Climate Finance Advisors, to tell us a little bit more about the results that have already been previewed a little bit. Stacy, over to you.
Thanks, Christina, and good morning, everybody. I'm Jonathan Cook with WRI and Stacy with Climate Finance Advisors. We're two of the co-authors of the paper that's being discussed today, and very pleased to have that opportunity to share some of the findings from this paper. We don't have time to really do it full justice today, but we certainly encourage all of you to take a look at the full paper, and we'd be keen to hear from you about your thoughts on what's in it and some of the issues it covers. So I'm going to actually turn over to Stacy to summarize some of the key findings from the paper, and then I'll come back afterwards to talk briefly about some of our recommendations. Stacy.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks both Patricia and Manish for framing up this discussion so well. And really welcome everybody to this webinar. So we'll get right into it. We're going to go through a few slides that summarize the findings, but as Jonathan just said, please go take a look at the paper. There's a lot of details in there that might be interesting for those of you who are following really what is an important and critical kind of component for financing nature-based solutions for adaptation. So first, why nature-based solutions for adaptation? This is a pretty important question. As a high-level matter, NBSA, or nature-based solutions for adaptation, are a critical part of a larger approach for integrating resilience and addressing adaptation needs for all countries around the world. And I think that awareness of the role of nature-based solutions in helping to address adaptation is only growing. They are also part of a systems-based approach. This is pretty important. If you're following some of the conversations these days around building in resilience, building back better, things that can kind of, from an infrastructure perspective, address adaptation and resilience, usually people tend to gravitate towards asset or specific project-based ideas. Nature-based solutions underscores the fact that a systems-based approach to resilience is really important. And they can help countries and communities address climate change, minimize or reduce impacts, and of course, generate economic gains, which are all too important. Many countries see nature-based solutions as part of an overall climate strategy, and their own increased attention to nature-based solutions has been increasingly integrated into strategies such as NDCs and national adaptation plans. So these are pretty important. Next bullet, Jonathan, thanks. They're also really important in terms of how countries and entities maximize the effectiveness of public dollars. And we'll talk a little bit more about that through the presentation here. They are, though, often inherently complex because they deliver public goods with returns over a long time horizon. That's pretty important. And they do require ongoing political support and financial support to ensure that their benefits can be delivered over the long term and over their life. At the same time, last bullet, Jonathan, please. Sorry, yes, at the same time, the rise of interest in using innovative approaches such as blended finance and insurance really makes the role of public capital all that more important. Among investment choices, both public investment and public-private partnerships, the public capital is really important. As a strategy for delivering public goods, it's very important. And of course, kind of public capital is one of those very important forms of capital and forms of funding that can help crowd in and leverage private capital where possible. Okay, so the importance of funding nature-based solutions for adaptation. This research is focused on the public flows for nature-based solutions that were specifically targeting adaptation investments. It is, as far as we can tell, the first ever assessment of global funding for nature-based solutions for adaptation. And we thought it was very important to put this diagram up. You'll find this also in the paper. We really are focused on things that are part of climate finance and also part of conservation finance. Having this assessment helps everyone, actually, countries and donors and those who are putting together project proponents, putting together nature-based solution projects, understand how much funding is flowing from the public side, and is really important to help have a better understanding of how much is there and then how best to use that money strategically. This paper identifies barriers also that, if addressed, can help donors maximize the impact of their public capital. And we think of this as a baseline of sorts, given that it is probably the first global assessment of public funding flowing towards nature-based solutions. We're looking specifically at funding from bilateral and multilateral donors. And as all of you know, in the climate finance space, these funds are really critical in the mobilization of private capital where it's possible. We also used interviews and research and identified important barriers from not just the financing assessment, but also the interviews. Okay. So what did we find? So here's the key findings. And again, there's a lot more details about the numbers inside the paper. So please go take a look. But let's start with the basics. The total amount of climate finance as of 2018 was roughly 579 billion. And the total public portion of climate finance in that year was 253 billion. These numbers are from CPI. As you know, CPI does the climate finance landscape every year. So roughly about 40% of total flows in 2018 were coming from the public side, coming from donors and public capital. Adaptation finance in the same year was about 42 billion. So roughly 10% of the total of climate finance and about 16% of the total public climate finance. Then what we were trying to find when we were doing our assessment was really what of the adaptation finance and what of the public climate finance was for nature-based solutions that address adaptation. And what we found was that the public funding tracked for developing countries for nature-based solutions ranged between about 3.8 billion and 8.7 billion. And when you get into the paper, you'll see why we did a lower and upper bound. There's some definitional issues about where the funding is tracked in the OECD databases. But overall, this is about 1/10 of 1% of total climate finance and about 3% of total public climate finance. The punchline is that this is shockingly low, particularly for such an important kind of approach to addressing adaptation and resilience for countries. Next slide. So where did it come from? And this is also broken down in great detail in the paper. But we have, from the sources and intermediaries side, we have bilateral and multilateral. On the bilateral side, Germany, over the period that we were tracking, was by far the greatest bilateral donor, but also the UK, Japan, and Sweden were significant donors for projects that were nature-based solutions for adaptation. And then multilateral donors, such as the MDBs and EU institutions, and of course the Green Climate Fund, also flowed a significant amount of funding to nature-based solutions. The largest recipients of funding from a geographical perspective were Sub-Saharan Africa and South and Central Asia. These two regions combined received about 50% of all flows the years we were tracking. And then uses. As you can see here, agricultural investments and projects that were driven towards agricultural support received the largest amount. And then other environmental projects and water, biodiversity for adaptation, and forestry were among the uses. So the barriers. So what we wanted to look at when we did the assessment of the funding was really what are barriers that prevent some of the scaling up that we may need of public capital in order to scale up nature-based solutions for adaptation, and also crowd in private capital where possible. So why are the figures so low? First, it was pretty clear through both the data analysis and the interviews that there really isn't currently, or there wasn't currently in 2018 where the data is set, wasn't currently a common definition of nature-based solutions for adaptation. The people that we interviewed expressed that this was an underlying kind of issue for them to either put together these types of projects or raise capital or access climate funding for these types of projects. The definition set was pretty broad, wide, and open to interpretation in some cases. Related to that, there's no clear metrics that exist for nature-based solutions for adaptation, and in particular for those folks who are interested in understanding the value of nature-based solutions, either because they're doing a cost-benefit analysis on a public financing side or private investors. That value is really important. Having a metric to value the economic and financial benefits of nature-based solutions is an important input into a financial decision-making process. And those metrics aren't yet there, although we know there's a number of activities and initiatives out there looking to put together some metrics around this. Donor sources of funding do not align with needs. This is really reflecting the fact that many of the funding sources were potentially not explicitly calling out nature-based solutions for adaptation, but where nature-based solutions for adaptation were maybe a co-benefit or a secondary kind of objective of a project. And the channels. So a lot of donor funds run through channels, whether they are intermediaries like the Green Climate Fund or the MDBs. There was a lack of priority within these organizations for pushing and promoting and explicitly asking kind of clients and countries to put together these types of projects. And that ask on the table is pretty important in terms of signaling to countries and project proponents that these channels are open for funding these things and really would like to prioritize them. And finally, because there's no explicit ask, and because potentially the definition is still ambiguous to folks, and potentially because the metrics are not there, we heard from a number of people that we interviewed that these result in challenges on the ground for countries and project proponents to really develop the pipeline, and that lack of pipeline is kind of a negative feedback loop, which is hindering the financing flows. So maybe with that, Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you to articulate some of the recommendations from the paper.
Thanks, Stacy. Thanks for that overview. I'm going to switch over, as you said, to the recommendations for the paper. We had 4 broad recommendations in this paper to address some of the barriers that you just went over. And these are aimed primarily at bilateral and multilateral donors and funding channels, as you'd expect. But we do also highlight some areas that are directly relevant for implementing countries as well. So the first recommendation really relates to the quantity of funding and how it's tracked. Now, while we didn't quantify the funding gap that exists directly in terms of what's needed to support emerging needs in this area, we felt that based on other analysis and demand from countries that's expressed through NDCs, NAPs, proposals to the GCF, et cetera, as proxies, there's clearly a clear need for additional funding. And as you've said, Stacy, public funding has such a key role to play in supporting NBS for a number of reasons. One of them being that it's important to crowd in the private financing that's ultimately needed to make financing more sustainable in many contexts. So as an initial recommendation, we hope that the donor community will be increasing its consideration of NBS in their next round of commitments and pledges on climate finance as we head into this key period, as Manish said earlier. And then we're looking forward to hearing from our distinguished panel in a little bit on some of their perspectives in this area. Now, as Stacy mentioned, our analysis was challenging, partly because the OECD data that we looked at is often incomplete and inconsistent. And so better tracking that uses consistent definitions would really help to improve this so that this landscape is better understood and monitored going forward. And this is something where donors need to work collaboratively, including with the OECD, DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, to adopt some of those more consistent approaches. In addition, more rigorous and consistent monitoring of results, including results in terms of co-benefits for adaptation from broader NBS-related investments that are being made, would also help. And so that's also a recommendation to the donor community, the climate funds, the MDBs, who are making, in many cases, broader investments on nature-based solutions, but not always considering those potential adaptation-related benefits from them. The second recommendation relates to the alignment of funding that is already flowing as opposed to new funding. I think from our assessment, and I think many would agree with this, a lot of funding in this area continues to support one-off projects that may be doing great work to advance ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation, but are perhaps not aligned necessarily with strategic priorities. And so ODA funding to really play the catalytic role that it can play needs to be strategic, needs to focus on scale, on achieving scale, where that's relevant, of course, and needs to support national and local priorities. And in addition, public funding can be targeted or structured to catalyze or leverage other funding more explicitly, to bring in domestic funds, to bring in private sector funds, and to thereby improve the sustainability of financing longer term. How can that happen? Donors and the funding channels they support can increase their risk tolerance and play some of that key role in buying down risk to allow private capital to come in and support these NBS investments that may be risky in some sense up front. And donors can also use public funding more strategically through flexible mechanisms, such as concessional instruments that crowd in capital, as well as grant support where it's needed. And a lot of the existing support has been grant-based, because in some cases, operational costs cannot be borne by local governments or others, and that grant support may still be needed over the life of a project to support some of those costs. Stacy talked a bit about the issue around metrics. Benefits of NBS for adaptation are significant, as I think many of us agree, but I think we'd also have to agree that there's often been a dearth of hard financial and economic data available to strengthen their consideration among other alternatives. And so common and consistent metrics and methodologies are needed to inform policy and investment decisions that are being made. For example, governments need to quantify the long-term costs and benefits, including the avoided costs from these approaches. And private investors need to see the short-term returns, or at least the shorter-term returns. And so there's a lot of work still needed in this area to produce those more commonly used metrics. So we're advocating that donors work together to develop, adopt, and accelerate common approaches to quantifying and valuing the benefits of NBS for adaptation. Something we've kind of called in the paper MRV for NBS for adaptation. MRV being kind of the approach that's been taken on the mitigation side, as most of you know. There are some relevant efforts underway or in development, including a new task force on nature-related financial disclosure that's quite exciting, and maybe advancing some of the efforts in this area. Finally, NBS approaches for adaptation are increasingly being highlighted by many countries, as has been said, but there's still much work to be done to adequately mainstream them into the budgets, plans, and decisions that are being made on development and adaptation, including in key sectors like agriculture and infrastructure. There's great opportunity, as Manish mentioned, to green some of the investments that are being made during this post-COVID, or it's not quite post, but this period of thinking about a post-COVID future and a lot of funds flowing towards recovery. And donors can play a key role through their technical assistance investments and capacity building, as well as helping to strengthen the development of a pipeline of projects by supporting project preparation in countries through technical design and economic analysis. Donors can also look for ways to directly support cities and communities and other local actors in building this pipeline and accessing funds. So this shouldn't just be a top-down process, it needs to also be bottom-up. In conclusion, IUCN, I think it's worth noting, has been developing a standard and criteria for good NBS projects. And I think a lot can be done to build on this effort, but to further define and operationalize the components that are adaptation specific, to really think about how this touches on adaptation and go forward from there. So I'll stop there. Again, thanks very much for tuning in today, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on the paper and engaging in further dialogue with all of you in this important area. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan and Stacey. I already see a lot of questions coming in the comment box and discussion about the paper and its recommendations already starting. And that's where we want to go. But just to really say thank you for doing this foundational landscape. But not only that, really looking at how do we catalyze more? What are some of the global public goods? What are some of the strategies that are needed to really scale up financing for adaptation through NBS solutions? So to delve into that a little bit deeper, we have a very distinguished panel here with us today. And I want to briefly introduce them and to jump straight into the panel. So first we have Ulrika Oxen, who is lead policy specialist for environment and climate change for the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. We have Chizuru Aoki, who is lead environmental specialist for the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. Matthias Bertram, the advisor on international biodiversity policies and nature-based solutions for Germany's Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, known as BMU. We have Ms. Rosa Morales Saravia, the General Director of Climate Change and Desertification for Peru's Ministry of Environment, and Alex White, the Team Leader on International NBS Policy and Finance in the UK's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. Ulrika, I want to start with you, if that's all right. So Sweden came up as a key supporter of NBS for adaptation in this analysis. And I guess I'd just like to hear from your perspective, why is this a priority for Sweden? Why is donor finance so important? And how do you see it being most impactful?
Well, thank you so much. Really glad to be part of this panel and also this discussion today. As you already said, Sweden has a large focus on adaptation in general, and nature-based solution is one tool in the toolbox, if one can say so, and one that has not been used to the extent possible, I think. And the important, as we see it at SIDA, is that it is bringing multiple benefits for both climate adaptation, ecosystem resilience, and long-term economic development. And environmental issues and the links to human development has been high on the Swedish agenda ever since the Stockholm Conference back in 1972, and SIDA also started to work systematically with issues such as biodiversity back already in the 90s. And Sweden has put a lot of emphasis on climate adaptation, including ecosystem-based adaptation, since before COP15 in Copenhagen and through the Commission on Climate Change and Development and in other ways. And I think luckily there's been a broad political consensus in Sweden regarding prioritizing environment in development cooperation. But the focus has been even stronger over the past couple of years as public awareness has risen, and not the least through Greta, other movements, and with our 3 latest ministers for development cooperation, all coming from the Green Party. But from a technical point of view, I think more research and evidence has also emerged that shows how nature-based solutions for adaptation can both be more sustainable in the long term and more cost-effective than conventional solutions with hard structures. And they can also provide multiple additional benefits, such as climate mitigation, improved biodiversity, and job creation, and alternative income opportunities, etc. We do see a growing interest from private actors and investors to approach nature-based solutions. And I think it is important that MDBs and DFIs that know and are tasked to improve infrastructure investments, that they also embrace and analyze if and how nature-based solutions can be applied. And as always, new partnerships between NGOs and investors have to emerge. And I think they can all draw on each other's knowledge and competences and capital. But development cooperation can play a very strategic role in relation to other type of finance when it comes to NBS. And we have seen a very positive effects of seed funding that other type of funding can't contribute with, for example, through our support to Pacific Institute, creating and advancing solutions to the world's most pressing water challenges, as an example. And we do look for opportunities, particularly where we can reach scale across more than one continent, if there's a business model with an income generating activity and where investors, local or global, shy away or hesitate because of the risk, then our guarantee instrument that we work with a lot at SIDA can be applied. But we are really interested in pushing the agenda forward, and what would it take for our multilaterals with the large infrastructure portfolios to truly and increasingly embrace nature-based solutions? But it's not only about finance. We see ourselves at SIDA playing an important role as a dialogue partner, and it is important to have the MBS approach part of the process through genuine participation, I think, in the design stage of support. And to give one concrete example of an NBS support that from SIDA, where we've seen that we can make a difference is, for example, through the IUCN Adapt project, increasing ecosystem and community resilience to climate change and environmental degradation by applying a nature-based solution in the Western Balkans. Which will be a great complement to hard infrastructure development projects, I think, by demonstrating how nature-based solutions can generate multiple benefits, including disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation mitigation, rural and urban development, employment, etc. And it's also important, I think, to contribute to many of the chapters and specific actions in the EU acquis in this particular case and other international conventions. And it could also support greening the recovery following COVID-19, And research shows that investment in MBS can really create a lot of jobs as well. So, but donors finance is a small part of the climate finance, and it has to be used wisely and catalyzing further action by others, I think. And this can be done by supporting pilots that can be used to make the case that can be replicated. And another important element is to crowd in other sources of finance by de-risking the investment that opens for pension funds and private investors to follow. And I think donor finance is still important, as nature-based solutions are still a relatively new, and many of the benefits are still public goods, which makes it difficult to completely rely on market mechanisms. And having said that, there are, however, several very interesting solutions and instruments that are evolving that can also mobilize private finance, such as insurance solutions or guarantees that can unlock investments into, for example, restoration of land and ecosystem services. And I think, I mean, donors can play an important role in helping partner countries to use nature-based solutions, including for climate action, and to do so throughout all stages of the policy-making process. And I think the effective integration of nature-based solutions when greening national development plans, national budgetary processes, and key economic sector strategies, then it's can really be seen that donors can also facilitate an access to tools and guidance available on NBS, and in sharing lessons learned and on different NBS approaches, including across partner countries through various platforms and networks. Yeah. So finally, just to summarize, CEDA is ready to embark on the journey of NBS for the adaptation, and we see great potential and are willing to push the agenda forward. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ulrika. So many different entry points there that you highlighted, so many different routes to get to scale. And I think we want to go deeper into those in this discussion. I want to turn next to Chiz Aoki from the GEF. The GEF, again, is another very important mechanism for supporting NBS. And as the GEF is starting to look at its next replenishment, and just did a fantastic consultation, wide and broad consultation a few weeks ago. I know you don't have a crystal ball, Chiz, but how do you see the GEF potentially catalyzing greater action on NBS? What do you think is sort of the next evolution of support that would really help scale things up in some of the ways that Ulrika was talking about?
Okay, thank you so much, Christina, for that wonderful introduction and setting it up. I wanted to share 3 points. One is that why nature-based solutions with multiple benefits, such as the ones that Ulrika talked about, are of particular relevance to the GEF. And second, talk a little bit about opportunities and concrete entry points for scaling up NBS action that we're already considering. And third, because this year is really special, I also wanted to talk about what needs to happen this year for the NBS action and the adaptation action to really be catalyzed further. So first, let me start by affirming that, yes, we're ready. The GF is ready to catalyze greater action on nature-based solutions, and also focusing further on NBS for adaptation. Christina, as you just said, we are really just starting the replenishment process for the next 4-year phase of the GEF. We're like the Olympics, so we operate in a 4-year cycle, right? So, but it's already clear to us that nature-based solution is going to be a very important issue. And this is because we know we have been supporting NBS from many different benefits, multiple benefits, particularly in biodiversity, climate change, and that also encompasses mitigation as well as adaptation, right? And as well as international waters. Somebody was asking the question on blue economy, and that's also part of nature-based solutions that's very important. And our interest and track record are stemming from, we think, our unique role as the financial mechanism for multiple conventions. And so I'm sure everybody knows, but just to repeat, we're an organization that supports 5 environmental conventions, namely climate change, biodiversity, desertification, but we also support activities in persistent organic chemicals and mercury, and they do have a lot of land-based actions. So looking at this from the lens of multiplicity as well as systemic intervention is quite important. So Stacy earlier talked about the systems nature of NES. Ulrich also touched upon the synergies and interlinkages of these many issues of the global environmental significance as well as adaptation. And from where we sit, MBS fits this bill for this challenge to facilitate synergy. So countries are coming to us increasingly to really look into how we can support the this kind of systemic interventions. For Jeff 8, at this particular juncture, nature-based solutions as well as resilience are already considered as an important cross-cutting theme for our next strategy, programming strategy. And that programming strategy is important because it kind of spells out eligible activities for countries to come and access the financing. So if certain elements are clearly spelled out as well as the boundaries, it also makes it easier for countries to come to us and say, okay, we want support for nature-based solutions with multiple benefits, also addressing adaptation elements. And just as a side note, yesterday I spent a little bit of time looking into a number of old programming directions for the GEF because we've been having this conversation on the definition of nature-based solutions for adaptation, where it comes from, right? And the term nature-based adaptation solution already appeared in our strategy as of 2014. And that was within the context of biodiversity and multiple benefits with adaptation solutions. Going back further and further, even in 2006, our replenishment documents were already talking about benefits of ensuring health of natural ecosystem as protection against adverse impacts of climate change. So a lot of early thinking as well, genesis of this kind of support that we really want to see catalyzed have been there for quite some time. And so funds like the GEF would need to continue to enhance our support. From where we sit, what is really important is that more countries also need to prioritize MBS. And for that, there has to be better awareness and capacity about MBS, how to address multiple benefits while minimizing trade-offs, and ensure policy coherence are all clearly really articulated and understood. And I think these are points that Ulrike already identified a little bit. So second point I wanted to raise is about opportunities for catalyzing greater action on NBS. We need to be supporting promising opportunities to enable us to scale up and replicate, particularly with good partners, financial partners, especially national governments and private sector, and also to be able to demonstrate innovative instruments, take that a step further. And I think the good news is that there are already initiatives, even the ones that are highlighted in this publication, that are being replicated and scaled up. And I just wanted to give two examples. One is the coral reef insurance. That was the example from Mexico. We all love this example with the TNC, as well as the whole notion of how to merge the insurance for the coral reef protection. So building on this example from Mexico, we are supporting a public-private partnership for coral reef insurance with Asian Development Bank. And we're trying to replicate the model in the Pacific, in Indonesia, Philippines, and Solomon Islands. The project is looking to improve the climate resilience of coastal businesses in these countries and communities and livelihoods in these countries through a fairly innovative PPP model that actually unites the private sector interest as well as the need for communities to address the health and systemic protection of coral reef. Another one example that was in the book is from Seychelles on debt for nature swaps. Very important, we want to see this replicated in other places. But we want to say there's another innovation that actually complements the debt for nature swap, and that is in the field of blue bonds, what to do with oceans and coastal communities. So in 2018, Seychelles was the first country in the world to introduce the notion of blue bonds, and we were very lucky to support this initiative. And the blue bonds were to finance marine and ocean-based projects with positive environmental, economic, as well as climate benefits, right? So we are now providing about $10 million, both in grant as well as non-grant instruments. So it's blended finance model. And to partially cover the interest payments for the bond, which the private sector have invested in. And the World Bank is providing the partial guarantees. So we would like to see this kind of parallel to a lot of interesting, innovative instruments to be replicated in other places, and we're ready to do that. One thing I wanted to highlight is it's actually interesting that these entry points and opportunities may be outside the usual climate finance initiatives, particularly for the GEF. So for water funds and blue bonds, it's our international waters investments that have been mobilizing private sector investments in here. And these types of investments may not be so easily captured when you're looking at the application of, let's say, just conservation or climate finance lens to articulate the mobilization of resources. So this is something that I think we'd be happy to work with the WR and the authors further if there is an interest as well as opportunity to further refine the methodological framework and do a little bit larger systemic interventions. So
thanks, Chiz.
Yeah, third and final point, what do we need to see? Obviously, it's an important year. We really want to see strong messaging coming across from both COP26, but also from COP15, because the CBD COP is supposed to be passing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The whole notion of MBS as well as linked to climate action are very, very relevant within that context of the global framework. So we really want to see that coming across. And I think Alex will talk further about the COP15, but we're very heartened to see a lot of discussions coming across on the importance of nature-based solutions for adaptation. One element we really, really would like to see, and it's sort of parallel as well was in the document, is like, we would love to see simply greater mobilization of finance for MBS. And this is the millions to billions to trillions argument. And we need to see this happening in climate finance and also for conservation finance. From where we sit, the constraint is not the lack of needs or prioritization. There are already NAPs, NDCs, and other documents. The key limiting factors for us and to support NBS are resources as well as capacity. So we really want to be able to, this year, address these barriers in a more cogent way. And I think Manish already talked about this. In the post-pandemic world, nature-based solutions are really considered to be attractive, not just for the potential to address environmental benefits, but they can also deliver multiple benefits for livelihoods and human well-being. What does this really mean is that we need to have a clear narrative, a win-win, and multiple benefits for policymakers to be really looking at these options as an important addition, because they're dealing with fiscal constraints and a context that is actually quite debt stressing with cuts of ODA. What this really means is that why it's really important for us to convey effectiveness of NBS for climate action. I think we really need to be quantifying and qualifying all the other benefits for NBS to address societal challenges, particularly when it comes to jobs, income generation, health benefits, potential GDP boost. Because without that, it's very difficult for this narrative to have traction within the context of COVID-19 recovery packages. So I think this is quite important for 2021 and all of us to address. So I'll stop right here. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chiz. Thanks. So a lot of great points there about how we mobilize the millions to billions to trillions, but also how we make this an irresistible offer for policymakers, showing the impact on jobs, on economic resilience, on regrowth, that it's contributing fundamental infrastructure for economies. Great. I want to turn next to Matthias, and in the interest of time, I'm going to ask everyone to please be brief, but also to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can answer some of those questions there. So Matthias, from your position at the top of the leaderboard in terms of one of the biggest funders of NBS for adaptation, according to this paper, what do you think is needed in this super year of events to scale up additional funding, both from the public sector and as previous speakers have highlighted, the private sector as well?
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of the BMU and the International Climate Initiative, or ICI for short. And I can just repeat what Manish mentioned, that the current pandemic shows us how much we depend on nature as our life insurance, and that nature-based solution needs to be an essential instrument in our toolbox for transformation including climate change adaptation. So this is also what Ulrika already mentioned, and what Chisura already said is we know that NBS can be very cost-effective measures to meet the Paris Agreement targets and also support the future global biodiversity framework under the CBD. And for this reason, BMU is very proud to have invested early in nature-based solution adaptation as part of the overall German ODA. So the findings of the report are quite impressive. So we were among the front runners funding what we call ecosystem-based adaptation, which is another synonym for nature-based solutions for adaptation, since 2008. And the EKS funded 60 projects worth over 356 million euros, focusing on EBA or nature-based solution for adaptation. So we know that nature is a big part of our solution to climate change adaptation. At least 50% of our global GDP depends on it, according to WEF. And as the report has found out that less than 1.4% of total public climate finance is allocated for it. So we still have to scale up tremendously. Scaling up funding is really key. And the IKI has already done so via several second-generation projects on EBA that really shifted the scale from smaller pilots to full-scale projects in land and seascapes. And if you ask me what is really needed to scale up finance, well, to me, there are three ingredients that are really essential for it, and they all start with an I: incentives, information, and investments. Well, starting with incentives, we clearly have to take advantage of the current policy incentives and momentum towards the UNFCCC and CBD COPs. I mean, this is clear. And both the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and the revision of the NDCs under the Paris Agreement, there are really big opportunities to integrate biodiversity and climate solutions for upscaling NBS finance, as Chisura already mentioned. Again, another incentive to me is the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which really 84 countries, including everybody on this panel, actually, Germany, UK, Sweden, Peru, and many actors like Jeff, business, cities, and civil society, they have committed themselves to what's promoting convergence between climate and biodiversity finance. So to me, this is a very powerful signal. But this is not enough. We need policy action from national to local level. This is even more important. And in the past 12 years, the IKI supported many partner countries in mainstreaming EBA into policy and legal frameworks at national to local level, from national public investment funding in Peru over EBA action and priority mapping in South Africa's biomes to coastal zone management at village level in Indonesia. So a wide range of possibilities that we see. So this is point one, the incentives. Second, information. To us, it's very important to use all available information to make the case for the multiple benefits of NBS. And this is also clearly stated in this report. We can just echo what is mentioned in the report. We need clear definitions, guidelines, metrics, and methodologies to track, quantify, and value benefits of nature-based solutions. And various IKI projects already made the case for it at various scales, building local capacities, piloting innovative approaches on evaluating the EBA benefits, and also incentivizing innovative finance mechanisms to scale up EBA at local, regional, and global level. I would just like to highlight 3 out of many knowledge products that have been elaborated under the Friends of EBA Network and the International EBA Community of Practice. Both are also supported by Germany, but not only. First, a source book of EBA evaluation methods for decision-making with over 40 application examples covering monetary and non-monetary benefits. Second, a report of 10 finance options and instruments for ecosystem-based adaptation from public to private funding, from international to domestic to local resources. And third, a recently launched guideline for monitoring and evaluating EBA interventions, which also has been supported by IKI implementers like WCMC and GIZ. So this is all brilliant news, but we also see that the new ecosystem accounting framework, which has been adopted last week by the UN Statistical Commission under the system of environmental economic accounting, this is also a key milestone for the valuation of nature, and hopefully it will ensure that natural capitals such as forests and wetlands and other ecosystems are recognized in economic reporting. So this can indeed be a game changer. Third, investments. It's important to mobilize investments to enable the scaling up of projects, including by leveraging funds from public and private actors. And we are happy that we could launch a 20 million euro global EBA fund, which is implemented by IACN and UNEP. It's a very good example, and I think it was already mentioned in the working paper and also in the chat here. And it provides a targeted and rapid support mechanism through seed capital for innovative EBA. So using public money to trigger additional financial resources. And it will pilot innovative EBA approaches and incentivize also innovative finance mechanism and private sector EBA investment. This is what we need as well. So this is all a start, but we need to further identify and intensify measures and opportunities and entry points for scale-up finance for NBS. And I think this report that is launched today is a very good example how this could be done. So we need to increase resilience not only towards the current risks like the pandemic we are facing, but also against all the slow onset crisis imposed by climate change and biodiversity loss. So we from BMU, we remain committed for this task. So thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Matthias. And if you get a chance, if you could post the links to the 3 papers you mentioned, I think those will be a lot of interest to everyone, if you could put it in the chat box. Next, I mean, we've heard a fair bit about country leadership, but I'm very excited to turn next to Rosa Morales to tell us a little bit how the government of Peru has been implementing some interesting models of NBS financing for adaptation, and how you've used donor capital to mobilize both domestic and private finance for NBS solutions. A little bit of what Matthias was just speaking to. Rosa Morales?
Yes, thank you, Christina. Thank you very much for inviting Peru to this webinar. I would like first to start by saying that as we all know, nature-based solutions are not new. We've been working on them for a lot of time. We've called them other definitions or other labels. But now it's maybe the time where we recognize that not only that nature is part of ourselves, but rather that they also bring solutions, and this is why this concept is so powerful in our view. In this sense, as you know, we've been working as many other countries on their nationally determined contributions, and in this sense, what we've started to do in order to realize where we stand in terms of nature-based solutions is that we used the IUCN framework, the definitional framework, to understand how much of our actions and initiatives in the NDCs can be defined as nature-based solutions. And what we find is that 35% of our NDCs can be interpreted as nature-based solutions. And also having this in mind in terms of the different aspects in which we've been working as a country on nature, we've been developing also some public financing tools, such as our framework law on climate change, which calls for our national system on public budgeting based on results, and also our national investment system. It calls these 2 systems, very important systems, to allocate public resources to work on climate change. And this is something that we've been working with the Ministry of Finance. And this work, I think that we are now at this very point in Peru, because we've been trying to work with the Ministry of Finance on climate change for more than 20 years. And now we have an important understanding. Of course, we need to further work on this with them. The other element that we have, apart from our climate change law, are the guidelines for formulating investment products, the investment projects. There, what we have is a framework that tells all sectors in the government that they can work on issues such as environmental services, on water scarcity, on disaster risk reduction. So we are trying to include all these elements in the different implementing sectors, which are how we call them. And thirdly, we also have a framework that works on the payment, on a mechanism for payments of environmental services. It is not, it was not conceived as only working for climate change, but rather as environmental services as a whole. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to make synergies between the work that we are specifically doing on climate change and all the other elements that we have to work regarding environment and nature as a whole. And this brings us with a more powerful set of instruments and frameworks that we can use to scale nature-based solutions. And going to the issues of the private sector, some of these elements are thought also to bring the private sector, and I would have to very much agree with Matthias when he speaks of these three elements of incentives, infrastructure, and investment. I think that all these three elements point very much, very well to the inclusion of the private sector. In Peru, the private sector at this very moment is starting to see, I'm speaking on the local private sector, and I think that after many years, they are starting to see how important they are, not only for Peru but for the global community. And for instance, this week we have a meeting because they are themselves making a project with the donors. And of course, it is not that this is the only thing they are doing, but what I want to highlight is that they are doing this with the donors. Some years ago, we didn't see that. So I think this is very important. And just to finish, some ideas regarding the role of donors, which was part of the question. I think that Ulrika make a very good point when she said that one of the things that the donors can do is to bring a dialogue. And in this sense, I think that the message the donors can bring to set the importance of nature-based solutions for adaptation, and all the co-benefits that we can have, but still do not missing the point of the importance of nature bringing solutions to people, is something that can be very well noted by by all the other colleagues we work with internally, because of course, the Ministry of Environment knows what we're talking about, but maybe the Ministry of Sanitation, of the Ministry of Energy, or the Ministry of Agriculture, they are not so close to these discussions and to all, the concepts around. And then one other very important thing is that we found that many of the interventions made through projects, they have a lifetime, and after that lifetime, that is the moment where we need the information, the evidence that we can collect in order to make the case that nature-based solutions can have a greater benefit than cost, so that we can speak with the decision makers that allocate the resources, meaning the Ministry of Finance mainly.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just the last point is that the societal challenges that we have to address are very more important maybe today after or with we're living right now the pandemic, right? So that is very important also in terms of the dialogue between donors and recipients. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa Morales, for highlighting the tremendous work that Peru is doing, and how you've been able to position this within the government, with the Ministry of Finance, with the sectoral line departments, but also bringing back the issue of dialogue, and how we frame the issue really and present the issue really matters in terms of generating that political momentum on so many different levels. That's really critical. And I'd like to turn to our final panelist, Alex from DEFRA, on this issue of framing and the discourse, because of course the UK is the host of COP this year, and you're really positioning nature very strongly within that discourse. But I'd love it if you could touch on that, but also other policy initiatives that can help bring coherence, like the G7 and the G20. Where do you see nature within those? Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you once again for inviting me to be a panelist here today. Again, just to recap a lot of the messages that have come across so far today, I think we need to recognize that nature is on the front line in terms of climate change and biodiversity loss, both of being affected by it and affecting the rate at which we lose biodiversity. And then we have a key role to play in helping ecosystem society adapt to the impacts of climate change. And NBS offers us a tool in the toolbox to help us do that, a really critical tool. I think reflecting on Ulrike's wording earlier on. And yet we know a little bit about the potential of nature-based solutions in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but we also know that it's grossly underfunded. And I think that this report has been really useful in articulating that further, and the disparity between potential and finance, as well as identifying the critical barriers to delivering on that. In relation to this year, I would refer to it as a year context rather than necessarily a COP26. COP26 is a very important milestone, but it's a journey. And this year we have the G7, which the UK is host presidency of. We have COP15 for the CBD. We also have the Food Summit, as Manish mentioned, the UNEP Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and then COP26. All of these are building on, I mean, we talk about a drumbeat, but it feels like a crescendo of dialogue and momentum behind nature as we discover how much we're losing and how important it is to us. And I think that very much is central to the UK's thinking around this year, 2021, around the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, as well as integrating nature into the way we tackle climate change. I think it's probably worth just thinking about the recent publication of the Dasgupta review in this context. So Professor Partha Dasgupta completed the review of the economics of biodiversity, in which they talked about, I think Manish's point earlier about the Ides of March is really interesting, and paying back our debts. And Professor Dasgupta set out the fact that I think we're constantly running into more debt by using more than we actually have. And his reframing of the sort of economic framework and the grammar we use around economics is a really timely reminder as to how much we do depend on nature. I think one of his quotes from the interim report was, without nature, we have no life. Really brings home the importance of what we are trying to do this year and over the decades to come, and the fundamental changes in how we think about and approach economics if we were to reverse some of the impacts we've seen so far in nature-based solutions and, Rosa mentioned, payment-free system services. Both are large in terms of Professor Scooter's thinking in that review. So I think all these is a very interesting context for 2021 and beyond. I think as we're thinking about the sort of different levers, I guess, throughout this year and what's been building up to this year, in terms of a political perspective, my thunder has been partly stolen by my colleagues from Germany in terms of the leadership's the leaders' partnership on Pledge on Nature, which signals a commitment to significant scale up in nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches, and enhancing resources from all sources, public and private, maximizing to significantly scale up support for NBS. I think this is a really critical point raised by others, is that there's a role for donor funding, but there's also a role for private funding, also the organizations that make up this sort of mosaic of funding mechanisms within that. I think the LPN was the first bit to try and galvanize that commitment. There's also the Adaptation Action Coalition that was launched in January this year, looking at sort of bridging this gap from ambition and looking down to how we work with countries to deliver that on the ground. Again, a critical piece that I think is missing from a lot of the commitments and ambition is moving from what we call sort of the rhetoric to delivery. We've had frameworks that existed for many, many years. And, as we've talked about, nature-based solutions is a new term, but something that we have been doing for a while. But why, for example, have we not met the Aichi targets, and how do we go about doing that in terms of biodiversity? How do we get to where we want to go, moving from the rhetoric to action? To the political side of things, then you have the financial side. So in 2019, the PM UNGA pledged to increase our climate finance to 1.6 billion. More recently, a portion of that, 3 billion, has been committed to spend on climate change that protect and restore nature and biodiversity. And we're kind of demonstrating through this announcement that we're ready to stand by with other countries and other donors into the integration of nature into development. And what we want is other donors and finance institutions to have a part to play in mobilizing finance at that sort of level globally. And that's one thing that we're looking for in over 2021. I think in relation to COP26 specifically, adaptation, resilience, as well as nature are central to our delivery for COP26. Building on our call for action that again was launched at the Climate Action Summit in 2019. COP26 gives a great opportunity to capitalize on that, to deliver on that front. And we're working very closely with our SCDO colleagues on the nature campaign for COP26, looking to raise ambition on tackling the combined challenges of biodiversity and climate change. So working with government, businesses, and civil society to set ambitious targets which reduce threats and restore nature's resilience. We're also looking to scale up financial support for nature and nature-based solutions to tackle both mitigation and adaptation, and to tackle the drivers of nature degradation and biodiversity loss, particularly deforestation, agriculture, and land use change. So I think across all those three areas, and given the momentum we're building up through this year, I think we are hopefully putting ourselves in a good place to try and increase ambition, to deliver on that ambition over the next, this is an intergenerational challenge of delivering nature-based solutions in a sustainable way. So, what we set up now needs to be able to withstand the impact of climate change, but also the pressures and needs of future generations as well. So I was very conscious of time. I think I might run over my 7 minutes, but I think that I'll close it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks. That's tremendous. We have only a little bit of time left, so I'm going to ask a quick question that was asked in the chat box, but also in some of the questions ahead of time. So we've talked about mobilizing the millions to billions to trillions. We've talked about the framing and the political discourse and the importance of that, the definitions and the tools that are needed. What I want to hear is, what are the best ways that we can bring it down to the local level? Because we need solutions to land in real places with real people. So how do we bring that financing down to the local level? And how do you build the capacity or energize really the capacity at the local level, at the grassroots level, to implement nature-based solutions for resilience and everything else that we've been talking about today? Anyone wanna start on that? And I can't see everyone, so I'll need you just to speak up and be bold. Rosa Morales, why don't you go first?
Yes. Okay, so when I was speaking of the framework that we have already to incentivize climate action, what we have now in Peru, for instance, is that every sector, meaning ministries, and every regional government and local government is now a climate change authority in their environment. That being said, this is also complemented with the indigenous peoples platform for climate change, to tackle climate change. They call it like that. So at least in Peru, what we have is the structure that we need in order to action be made in the grounds. There is a gap, though, in terms of capacities. Still, we're working also on capacities, which is a permanent work, but also in terms of preparing the projects and preparing the interventions. There is still a gap that we should fulfill. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa Morales. Chiz, over to you for quick thoughts on this.
Yeah, quick thoughts, no question. A lot of adaptation interventions, and adaptation is actually supposed to be local, right? So we really need to be focusing on the actual needs at the local level and have a mechanism to ensure that these local needs, as well as local community level engagements, could be translated into initiatives that could be supported. Couple ways. For instance, if it's really, really small scale, there's always the opportunity to do more decentralized, small scale, small grants type initiatives. That could also be not just project by project, but more an initiative that would be cutting across in the longer term. Another good entry point that we've discovered is trying to support initiatives at the subnational or city levels, because again, that brings down the level of intervention one layer, if you will, below the national or even global level. And then trying to articulate what are some of the adaptation priorities that could be addressed and articulated through the lens of cities, towns, and communities. We found that also to be a good intervention point. But, you know, I think Rosa's point is very well taken. We really need to be supporting the ability for any of us to be able to articulate and understand what the real community needs are. So.
Fantastic, Chiz. Alex, really briefly, and I'm afraid we need to wrap up, but over to you.
Yeah, super brief. Yeah, just reflecting Rosa and Chiz's view on the role of communities and local knowledge to be able to inform design of programs and products, but also I would add that recognizing the landscape of businesses at that level as well, making sure that financial products that are developed reflect those markets, both in terms of size and maturity and risk. I think I'll leave it there. That's probably short enough.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, local is also the private sector, in as much as it is local government, city government, etc. Great. I know we're rapidly running out of time, but I want to give the last word to Jonathan and Stacy for your reflections, your take-home messages from this discussion.
Great, thanks, Christina. Maybe I'll go first and then Jonathan can wrap us nicely. Just on that last point, I will say when you read the paper, we have a number of what we identified as important components for successful NBSA financing. And in our view, this is a list of 4 very fundamental ideas on how to accelerate financing for nature-based solutions for adaptation, one of which is engaging various stakeholders at the local level in a broad way. And in our view, this is really about, it's a necessary condition. It may not be sufficient. You still have to solve problems on getting the finance flowing, but absolutely, if you solve the problems on getting the finance flowing, but don't do the stakeholder engagement on the ground and you aren't very local, you still have an issue here. So we see these components, which include engaging various stakeholders, mainstreaming NBSA into adaptation and resilience strategies, providing the public funding in ways that are kind of catalytic and can bear risks and be aligned with project needs. And then, having the mechanisms to define, quantify the value of NBSA benefits is all really important components, each of which necessary, none of which by themselves are sufficient. So, so just a kind of nice segue from that last conversation. And I'll just say a number of the questions that came up today, both in the chat and in the Q&A section, are answerable in the paper. There's a lot of information in there. We couldn't get to all of them, but please feel free to take a look and be in touch if you have any comments or questions or want to find out more about what's behind some of the data and the analysis. This is very important work, and in particular, as we know, adaptation needs need to be scaled up. Building in adaptation and resilience is not simply asset-based, but systems-based, and nature-based solutions for adaptations are part of that solution and really need to be kind of considered in the broader scope of the international community, the funders, the donors, and countries on how to address climate change. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jonathan, to wrap us up.
Thanks, Stacey. And I just want to thank our panel for their great contributions and also the audience for some great questions. Again, we don't have time to do justice to all of them, but some of them are, I think quite a few of them are answered in the paper. So please take a look. Just a couple of quick reflections from the conversation. One is, again, I think we don't argue that public financing is all that's needed. And in fact, I think a lot of the paper is kind of demonstrating the importance of public financing to catalyze the private investment that's out there that we so badly need to flow more into this space. So just want to respond on that point. Of course, though, in many countries where private investment or private capital is not as maybe present, public funding continues to play a critical role because ultimately adaptation, as we know, is a public good. And so there are multiple reasons why this funding is so important. Second is, a lot of interesting questions about terminology. And I just want to say that part of the reason for our use of NBS for adaptation, as opposed to the more commonly known ecosystem-based adaptation, which are quite complementary, I think we really want to acknowledge that there's a big discussion about nature-based solutions out there internationally right now and in many countries. That continues in some cases to be very dominated by mitigation benefits and outcomes. And part of the idea here is to really bring that together because there's such a missed opportunity in so many places to take advantage of the synergies and to think about the co-benefits, which a lot of us have spoken about. And so this was a bit of a deliberate attempt to really place this in that context. And then finally, I think some really good points in the chat about governance, enabling environment, local action. So again, this isn't just about more money, it's about the quality of what's done with the funding and the sorts of complementary investments and steps that need to be taken in many places to ensure that that funding is used strategically, wisely, catalytically, et cetera. So all really good points that I think came out of some of the questions. I want to thank everybody again for tuning in today and pass back to Christina.
Thanks, Jonathan. And in the 30 seconds we have left, I really want to say thank you to all our panelists and speakers for sharing your reflections, your experiences so openly, and really just to say this is the beginning of a conversation. This is not the end. Please do reach out. We want to keep the conversation going, and do have a look at the paper. And we will post this afterwards. So hopefully it will be an ongoing resource to you. And thank you very much for your attention. And with that, have a good rest of your day. Take care, everyone.